Chapter 22 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 22, The Contraband. The first movement of armed forces proved that the slavery question was destined to be as omnipresent in war as it had been in national politics. When immediately after the Baltimore massacre, General Butler, with his Massachusetts regiment, appeared by sea before Annapolis, one of the first rumors which came to him from shore was that the Maryland slaves were about to take advantage of the public disturbance to rise in insurrection against their masters. Butler, to assure the Marylanders that his mission was friendly and not hostile, thereupon offered the use of his forces to Governor Hicks to quell any such rising. Governor Hicks thanked the general for the tender, but replied that the civil authorities were strong enough to control all danger of that character. When the incident came to the knowledge of Governor Andrew of Massachusetts, he wrote a strong disapproval of the general's offer. I think the matter of servile insurrection among a community in arms against the Federal Union is no longer to be regarded by our troops in a political, but solely in a military point of view, and is to be contemplated as one of the inherent weaknesses of the enemy. I can on this occasion perceive no reason of military policy why a force summoned to the defense of the Federal Government at this moment of all others should be offered to be diverted from its immediate duty to help rebels who stand with arms in their hands, obstructing its progress towards the city of Washington. Butler warmly defended his conduct on the score of humanity, alleging that the cause of the Union would not be advanced by permitting the indiscriminate massacre of defenseless women and children. This humane feeling was the dominant one with the Union commanders. When General McClellan moved his forces from Ohio into West Virginia, and also when General Patterson prepared to advance from Pennsylvania and Maryland against Harper's Ferry, both issued orders specially enjoining their subordinates to suppress all attempts at an insurrection of the slaves. A new phase of the question, however, soon presented itself. General Butler, as we have seen, was sent to take command of Fort Monroe and to organize expeditions against the rebel works in his neighborhood. He had as his opponent the energetic General John B. Magruder, who, sparsely supplied with men, sought in multiplied earthworks the best means of defense immediately available. Rebel batteries rose with astonishing rapidity at every landing place, point, inlet, and country road, and for the erection of these batteries the Negro field hands from the well-stocked plantations of lower Virginia were employed by him through a rigorous military impressment. The Negroes sometimes found and eagerly embraced opportunities to escape to the Union lines under these new conditions. A policy speedily developed itself on the part of their owners to remove not only the laborers but also the families of the slaves from the exposed and insecure hostile border to more remote places in the interior. Very soon, therefore, Fort Monroe became to the discontented blacks in the vicinity the center of a vague hope, both of escape from removal to the dreaded far South and of possible liberation from bondage. General Butler had been in command at his new post but a few days when a rebel flag of truce applied to him, among other errands, to return 3 Negro field hands belonging to a Colonel Mallory. The general found that these 3 slaves sought refuge in the fort to avoid building batteries in North Carolina. The flag bearer demanded that they should be restored to their owner under the injunctions of the Fugitive Slave Act. General Butler warily responded that since Virginia claimed to be a foreign country, the fugitive slave law could not possibly be in operation there, and declined on that ground. If their master would come to the fort and take the oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, he said he would deliver the men up to him and endeavor to hire their services of him. The flag bearer could only answer the home thrust by saying that Colonel Mallory was absent. Out of this incident seems to have grown one of the most sudden and important revolutions in popular thought which took place during the whole war. General Butler has had the credit of first pronouncing the opinion, or formulating the doctrine, that under the principles of international law, the Negro slaves, whose enforced labor in battery building was at the moment of supreme military value to the rebels, were manifestly contraband of war, and as such confiscable by military right and usage. There is no word or hint of this theory in his letter which reports the Mallory incident, nor any other official mention of it by him until 2 months afterwards, when he stated incidentally that he had adopted such a theory. Nevertheless, it is very possible that the idea may have emanated from him, though not at first in any authentic or official form. It first occurs casually in a newspaper letter from Fort Monroe of the same date with the Mallory incident. Again, the Negro must now be regarded as contraband, since every able-bodied hand not absolutely required on the plantations is impressed by the enemy into the military service as a laborer on the various fortifications. Whether the suggestion was struck out in Butler's interview with the flag bearer, or at the general's mess table in a confidential review of the day's work, or whether it originated with some imaginative member of his staff, or was contributed as a handy expedient by the busy brain of a newspaper reporter, will perhaps forever remain an historical riddle. But public opinion was ripe for this and other steps in political reasoning, and the thought sprang full-statured into popular acceptance. Within a few days, a new phrase was on everyone's lips, and the newspapers were full of editorials chuckling over the happy conception of treating fugitive slaves of rebel masters as contraband of war. A few months more of active campaigning materially shortened the formula, and every Negro in and about the army became familiarly known and designated as a contraband. Indeed, the word acquired much more than a mere slang value. One would be sadly puzzled to read the literature of the war in detail without knowing that an intelligent contraband, or reliable contraband, meant some man, woman, or child of the enslaved race. The question of colored fugitives, first presented in the Mallory incident, quickly grew to importance. 3 days later, General Butler reported that slave property to the value of $60,000 was in his hands. Fugitive slaves in squads were flocking into his lines, bringing women and children, whole families leaving plantations together to avoid being sent further south. Being greatly in need of laborers, he received all who came, issued them clothing and rations, and employed the able-bodied in work. His course was approved by the government, and the Secretary of War wrote, under date of May 30, "The Department is sensible of the embarrassments which must surround officers conducting military operations in a State by the laws of which slavery is sanctioned. The government cannot recognize the rejection by any State of its federal obligations, nor can it refuse the performance of the federal obligations resting upon itself. Among these federal obligations, however, no one can be more important than that of suppressing and dispersing armed combinations formed for the purpose of overthrowing its whole constitutional authority. While, therefore, you will permit no interference by the persons under your command with the relations of persons held to service under the laws of any State, you will, on the other hand, so long as any State within which your military operations are conducted is under the control of such armed combinations, refrain from surrendering to alleged masters any persons who may come within your lines. You will employ such persons in the services to which they may be best adapted, keeping an account of the labor by them performed, of the value of it, and of the expense of their maintenance. The question of their final disposition will be reserved for future determination. The Negroes who came into General Butler's lines at Fort Monroe were thus disposed of on a theory and rule with which everybody but the enemy was reasonably satisfied. But the question presented itself in a more embarrassing shape at Washington. Slavery existed in the District of Columbia, and here, directly, as it were, under the President's eye, slaves began to make their way across the Potomac into General McDowell's camps, where they could find plenty of officers willing to afford them a hiding place in order to secure their help as servants. This could not be justified upon any contraband or confiscation theory. And President Lincoln, who had in his inaugural address indicated that his oath bound him to execute the fugitive slave law as well as every other law, felt it incumbent on him to order that there should be no indirect violation of existing statutes by the army. Nor could he allow himself to be placed in an attitude where the senators and representatives of Maryland and the other border slave states he was endeavoring to hold in the Union might accuse him of bad faith or of intentionally evading his constitutional obligations. The following monition, therefore, went from Army Headquarters to General McDowell. The General-in-Chief desires me to communicate to you that he has received from the President of the United States a second note dated today on the subject of fugitive slaves, in which he asks, would it not be well to allow owners to bring back those which have crossed the Potomac with our troops? The General earnestly invites your attention to this subject, knowing that you with himself enter fully into His Excellency's desire to carry out to the fullest all constitutional obligations. Of course, it is the General's wish the name of the President should not at this time be brought before the public in connection with this delicate subject. At the same time, the local commander in Washington issued his order that fugitive slaves will under no pretext whatever be permitted to reside or be in any way harbored in the quarters and camps of the troops serving in this department. Neither will such slaves be allowed to accompany troops on the march. This order, if it did not serve effectually to keep Maryland contrabands out of McDowell's lines, at least quieted the complaints of Maryland representatives in Congress. The President, however, did not make his own local action in Washington a precedent or a guide for commanders in other departments. He had wisely divined from the beginning that his true policy lay in making the question in every case a matter of local determination, to be governed by military necessity and to be devolved upon the responsibility of the local military commander. It is doubtful whether the directions of Mr. Lincoln above quoted would have given him long respite between the clamors of pro-slavery congressmen on one side and anti-slavery congressmen on the other, had not the current of actual war served gradually to change and simplify the problem. At the date of issuing these orders, the march to Bull Run had begun. The battle and defeat followed a week later, and in the excitement and demoralization of the army and the rapid drift of public opinion which immediately ensued, the recovery of an absconding field hand or house servant was too trifling a matter to occupy the attention of either congressman or president. The passage of the Crittenden Resolution and of the Confiscation Act by Congress occurred shortly afterwards, and what was yet more important, the great military disaster had carried public opinion to the point of accepting the subordination of every question and every interest to the single hope, purpose, and object of successfully prosecuting the war and subduing the rebellion. Still, in one form or another, the Negro problem was continually forcing itself upon the attention of the government. The local orders excluding slaves from camps about Washington had come to the knowledge of General Butler at Fort Monroe, and desiring that his own administration should not violate the spirit of superior orders, he applied to the War Department for definite instructions under the new condition of affairs. Since the defeat at Bull Run, several of his regiments had been called away to reinforce Washington, and in contracting his lines he was obliged to abandon the village of Hampton, which, having been previously abandoned by the insurgent Virginians, had become a village of Negroes, men who worked in throwing up entrenchments, and women engaged in washing and marketing, all living upon the rations supplied by the fort. As the army retired to the immediate vicinity of Fort Monroe, all these fugitives followed in a mass, and he reported to the War Department, "I have therefore now within the peninsula this side of Hampton Creek 900 Negroes, 300 of whom are able-bodied men, 30 of whom are men substantially past hard labor, 175 women, 225 children under the age of 10 years, and 170 between 10 and 18 years, and many more coming in." The questions which this state of facts presents are very embarrassing. First, what shall be done with them? And second, what is their state and condition? Are they property? If they were so, they have been left by their masters and owners, deserted, thrown away, abandoned, like the wrecked vessel upon the ocean. If property, do they not become the property of the salvors? But we, their salvors, do not need and will not hold such property, and will assume no such ownership. Has not, therefore, all proprietary relations ceased? Have they not become thereupon men, women, and children? Is a slave to be considered fugitive, whose master runs away and leaves him? Is it forbidden to the troops to aid or harbor within their lines the Negro children who are found therein? Or is the soldier, when his march has destroyed their means of subsistence, to allow them to starve because he has driven off the rebel masters? Now shall the commander of a regiment or battalion sit in judgment upon the question whether any given black man has fled from his master or his master fled from him? Indeed, how are the free-born to be distinguished? Before the War Department answered these inquiries of General Butler, the Confiscation Act had been passed by Congress and signed by the President, which forfeited and annulled the property rights of owners in slaves whom they required or permitted to be employed in aid of rebellion or in hostile service against the government of the United States. The problem had thus been materially reduced. The reply of Secretary Cameron, under date of August 8, 1861, while declaring that it is the desire of the President that all existing rights in all the States be fully respected and maintained, laid down in substance the following general principles. 1. In loyal States and Territories, claims to fugitives from service must be prosecuted through ordinary judicial proceedings and be respected alike by military and civil authorities. 2. In States wholly or partly in insurrection, where ordinary laws temporarily fail, rights to service, like other rights, must be necessarily subject to military necessity, if not wholly forfeited by treason. 3. The military authorities must obey the Confiscation Act and refuse to recognize any claim to service forfeited by treason. 4. In insurrectionary states where laws are suspended, claims to service cannot safely be decided by military authority. Under these circumstances, it seems quite clear that the substantial rights of loyal masters will be best protected by receiving such fugitives, as well as fugitives from disloyal masters, into the service of the United States, and employing them under such organizations and in such occupations as circumstances may suggest or require. Upon the return of peace, Congress will doubtless properly provide for all the persons thus received into the service of the Union, and for just compensation to loyal masters. Aside from its mere legal definitions, this letter of instructions, after all, left military commanders full authority to decide to which class any contraband might belong, and thus invested them with practical authority to manage the whole position as to each seemed best. While Butler, therefore, at Fort Monroe was virtually freeing colored fugitives, Dix at Baltimore was declaring that we have nothing to do with slaves. We are neither Negro stealers nor Negro catchers, and that we should send them away if they come to us. Sherman and Buell in Kentucky issued substantially the same orders as Dix, and Halleck in Missouri employed nearly the same language. The undercurrent of practice, however, ran in an opposite direction. The love of novelty, curiosity, restlessness, and the slave's irrepressible longing for liberty were constantly bringing him into the military camps, where the eagerness of officers and privates to use him in service of camp work and drudgery nearly always made him welcome and gave him protection. Considerations of self-interest were more active than moral theories or legal responsibilities. Officers who were called upon to decide this question of political duty generally solved it by keeping the contrabands and setting them to work as servants, laborers, and teamsters, and the orders of commanders were gradually relaxed to permit this to be done. This field of usefulness enlarged as armies grew and campaigns increased in activity, and especially when the armies penetrated the South, advancing from half loyal to more thoroughly secession communities, all obligations to return fugitives faded out, because the Confiscation Act of Congress became substantially applicable to the entire population. At important military posts, where contrabands flocked in numbers which outran the needs of local labor, a solution was reached by transferring them to other places. General Wool at Fort Monroe during September received an order to send to General McClellan at this place, Washington, all Negro men capable of performing labor accompanied by their families. They can be usefully employed on the military works in this vicinity. A little later he was asked to select 1,000 active contrabands to accompany a naval expedition to the southern coast. Under requirements of this character, the employment of fugitives gradually became systemized, and during the months of October and November, General Wool adopted formal regulations prescribing the pay and rations of colored persons called contrabands employed in his department, adding with evident satisfaction to his letter of transmittal, "They are made to support themselves." End of chapter 22.